Dating apps create abundance for women, scarcity for men, then profit from both. Dating apps also promise to make finding love easier. Instead, they have turned attraction into an algorithm, attention into a currency, and rejection into a business model. Women are overwhelmed by choices, and men are scrambling just to be seen. And with a potential match just one swipe away, the chances of finding someone to settle down with and be in a serious relationship with become vanishingly slim. In this episode, I want to talk about the major differences in dating apps between women and men. So, without further ado, I'll just give you a bit of a background to my experience with dating apps. So, I was actually dating or using the dating apps, if you will, before they really existed. So, I was on a website that was called POF, or Plenty of Fish, back in the day. And this was one of the only real sort of dating websites that we used really for serious dating, but also for hookups. And you also had groups like OkCupid and obviously eHarmony being the most famous one as well. So that was in about 2013. And then I think by late 2013, early 2014, Tinder came on the scene, obviously as a mobile app, and changed the dating game forever. Initially, when I first started using that app, I had a lot of success, regretfully, actually. And so I had a lot of matches and it was overwhelming. And I think that led to probably a lot of promiscuity on my part, which I regret and would discourage men from seeking themselves. Okay, so in the manosphere, you often hear about this idea of needing to sleep with as many women as possible and to leverage these dating apps or indeed blatant hookup apps just to get sex. And I would really say to you that that is not a good idea, and to not do that at all, to have some control over your sexuality, okay? A man who can be controlled by sex is easily controlled overall, okay? That's something that I've mentioned before in one of my earlier videos, I think the Harsh Dating Truths video that I did. So with that said, let's go through a little bit of data today. So obviously there's two sexes and two different apps effectively based off that, right? Now, when I say two different apps, I don't mean literally two different apps, but I mean that if you're on an app, say, like Tinder, the app effectively functions for a woman completely different to the way it functions for a man, and for all intents and purposes, is it almost a different app in and of itself. Okay, so what I'm saying is, I guess, that men and women may download the same app, but the service that they get from that app and the outcomes they reap from that app are vastly different. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because of the data. So let's look at United States data from Pew Research in 2020. So Pew Research found that 50%, actually more than that, Pew Research found that 57% of male online daters said they received too few messages, compared with only 24% of women. So just to reiterate, the Pew Research indicated that 57% of men indicated that they received too few messages on dating apps, compared to 24% of women, okay? Now, further still in that same research, 30% of women said they received too many messages, which was 5 times the 6% reported by men. So that's a bit of a difference, isn't it? 30% of women indicated that they received too many messages from men on dating apps, whereas only 6% of men had the exact same complaint. Now, effectively, what we're seeing here is a core divide, aren't we? So we're seeing that many women are entering an environment of abundance, whereas many men are entering an environment of scarcity. Okay, and so they have that scarcity mindset and perhaps even that desperation around dating, whereas women can sit back very nonchalant and also have their egos inflated by the sheer number of matches that they get, which I will talk about here now. So let's talk about the match gap, okay? So really, for the average woman, getting a match is just an ordinary outcome, whereas for the average man, it can feel like a real event, something they really get excited about and really want to act on as soon as possible, okay? And that perhaps plays back with that scarcity mindset that I referred to. Now, what we know from research on Tinder from London and New York from 2016 is that with female test profiles, those female test profiles matched with 10.5% of the users they liked, whereas the male profiles only matched with 0.6% of the profiles they liked, which represented a 17.5-fold difference. Let me repeat that, okay? The Tinder study found that female test profiles matched with 10.5% of the profiles they liked, whereas the male test profiles only matched with 0.6% of the profiles they liked, representing a 17.5-fold difference. That is incredible, right? And if you think about that, 10.5% for a woman you think's probably actually a bit low. So I'm not sure what those test profiles look like, but I would say they probably used conventionally attractive women or even just average women to get those numbers, because if they're above average, I could probably assure you that those numbers would be higher, and probably for the men it would be higher too, if we're being fair. That's just basic attractiveness and I guess the halo effect that may occur in dating. Now, within that same study, the female test profiles exceeded 200 matches within their first hour of downloading the app, whereas men's matches grew very slowly and very gradually over time. Okay? Think about that. When a woman is downloading the app on Tinder, there is a very real possibility that within her first hour of using that app, she may get up to 200 matches, whereas a man will not get anywhere near that. In fact, he'll be lucky to get any matches within his first hour, and if he gets any matches, it will be very slowly and very gradually, okay? That is a massive difference, okay? And talk about abundance versus scarcity. Well, there's your case in point. Now, not only that, but the same study found that men obviously liked profiles far more broadly, whereas women, when they liked the profiles, were far more specific in what they were looking for and far more selective, which is reinforcing that match imbalance. Now, I don't think that's any surprise to anyone just in the dating world, regardless of apps, that women are the sexual gatekeepers, and because they do have access to men whenever they want, they can afford to be picky, right? Men don't have that privilege, okay? Women are also found in some studies that although men are judged on being shallow because they generally are attracted to a woman based on her appearance, right? So a man sees a woman and they go, she's really attractive, I like the way she looks, and they make a judgment on whether to pursue her based on that. When a woman does the same equivalent, her standards of what she's looking for in an appearance are far more arbitrary and far stricter, and really you could say far more shallow. So, classic case in point, as I discussed in one of my other videos about dating, the vast majority of women, or at least 49% to 69% or thereabouts, probably higher if we're being honest, will not date a man who is under 6 foot, okay? Now, that man could have other redeeming features like a handsome face, he could have a nice body, a good income, a beautiful personality, great family values, all sorts of lovely things. But the fact of the matter is, if he's not 6 foot, none of that matters to most women. Whereas for a man, what they've found in research is that a man may have a preference for larger breast size, for example, but if he meets a woman and her breast size isn't in that range that he would generally go for, but she has other beautiful redeeming features like a really pretty face or a larger buttocks or a smaller hip to waist ratio or lovely hair or lovely eye color or lovely skin, then he will forget about the breast size and be more than happy pursuing that woman and be more than happy entering into a long-term loving relationship with that woman. Okay? So whilst men are more immediately attracted to looks, their actual preferences and forgiveness of any potential, what you'd say, flaws or discrepancies in a woman's body are less of an issue for him. He's far more forgiving. Women are far less forgiving if the man simply is not tall enough. Simple as that, okay? So that's a myth we need to dispel right there. Now, if we move along, we can talk about, obviously, the algorithms more specifically, and how the fact of the matter is that algorithms amplify popularity, okay? Algorithms, quite simply, amplify popularity, okay? Struggling with the word popularity there for some reason. Might have had a bit of a stroke. So, effectively, the algorithm does not distribute romantic opportunity equally, okay? It concentrates it around who the most attractive people are, and then it amplifies that, right? That's built into the algorithm, and that's part of a business model decision, okay? Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that from South Korean dating app studies, and we know that in those studies from 2024, researchers analysed 3 months of recommendation data from more than 240,000 users. And what they found with those users is that the users with higher attractiveness and popularity scores were significantly more likely to be recommended further to others on the dating app. Okay? Now, in addition to that, those popularity-based recommendations generated more engagement messages, revenue, and neutral recommendations as well. So the fact of the matter is, if you're a really attractive person, you effectively, for the app, become a brand ambassador and an influencer without even knowing it. Okay? Now, what do we know? Well, we know that on average, men and women both view women compared to men as more attractive on average. Women view women as more attractive on average compared to men, and men view women as more attractive on average compared to men, right? Now, if you think about that, then automatically, if we have these dating apps and we know that the dating app algorithms favor people who are very attractive, who are then more likely to be popular, and they're more likely to create a demand for them, then we're also going to see that tying with the fact that the apps are geared towards maximizing outcomes for women. Okay? So that's just the way that is. Now, that's a double-edged sword for women, right? Because this overabundance of popularity and attraction creates what's referred to as the paradox of choice, okay? They have such an overwhelming amount of choice, right, that they don't know what to do with it, all right? So the fact of the matter, and the harsh reality, the harsh reality for women is that the illusion of unlimited choice on a dating app, okay, does not correlate with them having better outcomes in finding a serious romantic relationship. In fact, the relationship is inverse in nature, okay, and negatively so. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that based on data from the University of Wisconsin in 2017. So the University of Wisconsin in 2017 did a study, and they used 152 participants, selected a partner from either 6 or 24 dating profiles. So let me restate that. So University of Wisconsin in 2017, they got 152 participants and got those participants to select a partner from either a set of 6 profiles or 24 profiles on these dating apps. Now, what they found is that those choosing from the 24 dating profiles had a reduced satisfaction in the people on those dating apps 1 week later, and were more likely to actually reverse their decision once they did find someone in that group of 24. Now, in addition to that, the study then also found that viewing those profiles effectively created that paradox of choice, okay? Now, that was actually then later in a study from the University of Vienna in 2022, and it was supported. So that study from the University of Vienna in 2022 found that people, when they viewed either 91 profiles rather than 11 profiles had increased choice overload and fear of remaining single while reducing their self-esteem. Okay? Now, think about this. Like, this is obviously content for men, but let's bring the women in here because this is important for them to hear as well. Those studies I just said have quite clearly shown that if a woman is given less profiles to choose from versus more profiles to choose from, if she chooses the option with more profiles, there is a higher likelihood that she will be more dissatisfied with her choices and regret those choices, and in fact reverse those choices once she does choose someone to date. Now, the Vienna study as well supported that, obviously, as I've just said, and found that there was an increased choice overload, which actually then resulted in those women experiencing lower self-esteem at the end of it. Well, that's not too good, is it? That's pretty negative for women. So while you've got all that choice, it's actually damaging your mental health. Meanwhile, the men on the other side are barely even matching anyway, so they're experiencing that suffering at a different kind of level. And suffering maybe is a bit of an extreme word, let's be honest. It's not Auschwitz, right? But let's also look at this in economic terms. And what do I mean in economic terms? Well, let's look at the opportunity cost of the app. And specifically, let's look at when the opportunity cost becomes rejection. Okay, so effectively, what we see, and this is just a continuation of what I've just said, is that when another option is always one swipe away, commitment begins to feel like you're losing another person that you could have chosen from, right? So that creates a psychological looping mechanism that each time you go on a date and the date was pretty nice, and maybe say you're a woman in this case, because this is really mainly only applicable to women's behavior. If a woman goes on a date with you and she likes you and thinks you're a lovely guy, thinks you're funny, thinks you're nice, but maybe you said something that was a little bit off, made her a little bit uncomfortable, gave her the ick, or maybe you're a bit awkward and clumsy with your language because you're nervous, which is very common, particularly for guys, because they're getting so few opportunities to date and actually practice dating that when they get the opportunity, of course they get a bit anxious and they're more likely to stumble, right? Well, should that happen, you can be guaranteed that as soon as she goes back to the car, turns on her phone, right? She's going to have ding, 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 and she's going to have potentially 20 or 30 matches in that 1 or 2 hour date that you've just had with her that she can now choose from. And as I've just said, when another option is always just one swipe away, the commitment begins to feel like you're losing a person you did not choose, right? And you focus and obsess about that. Now, let's look at that a bit more in terms of the opportunity cost. Well, effectively, what happens is that a person, man or woman, let's say man or woman, right, in this instance, although I think we can tell by now this is actually more of an issue for women, right, given that they have the plethora of choice, is that when a user of a dating app has endless alternatives at their disposal, right, it means that they may focus less on the opportunity they have in front of them to potentially build a serious, loving relationship that ultimately is going to benefit them in a very serious way. Okay, let's not pretend that relationships aren't really important. They are incredibly important. Human beings are social creatures, and we need love. Okay, that's what we need. Now, if we look at that a little bit further, let's look at across as an experiment that was done between the United States of America and also over in, I believe it was Norway. Actually, no, sorry. It was a study. There was a study between the US and Denmark as well. The US and Denmark. So those US and Denmark experiments in 2020 found that across 3 Tinder-style studies, okay, users became progressively less likely to accept a profile as they continued swiping. In fact, they found a 27% decline from the first profile viewed to the last profile viewed. Let me reiterate that. A US study combined with a study from Denmark in 2020 found that the longer someone swiped between the first profile to the last profile, the longer they did that, they found that by the time they got to that last profile, there was a 27% decline in their satisfaction with those profiles, right? So that's quite interesting to note. And in that same study, I should add, specifically with women became increasingly selective across all three studies when profiles represented real potential partners. This reduced their likelihood of forming a match. Okay? So the more time that is spent on the app, the longer someone looks between the first profile they see and the last profile they see, if they even see a last profile, because they're doing this in perpetuity, right? They will experience a decline of 27% of the satisfaction of those profiles. And in addition to that, they will become even more selective. So they become more selective and less happy and less likely to actually match anyone, okay? Which is a really, really interesting thing to see, right? And when I say that 27%, acceptance, what I mean specifically is a 27% reduction in accepting a profile. So maybe I should even reword all that. Let me backtrack here and fix this for the record in case anyone picks this up. The US and Denmark experiment found across its 3 Tinder style studies that the longer users became... Hang on. Let me think about this. The US and... I'm having an aneurysm, guys. Bear with me. I want to get this right. I've sort of stated it, but I want to be clear. The US and Denmark experiments in 2020 across 3 Tinder-style studies found that users became progressively less likely to accept a profile as they continued swiping, okay? What did that look like statistically? Well, it was a 27% decline from the first profile to the last profile, which I've sort of already reiterated, so I have no idea why I repeated all that. You get the point, okay, without going on and on about it. So anyway, this is really interesting to see, and I would encourage you to go back and watch my Harsh Dating Truths original episode on dating, and then come back and watch this as well again, and you can put them together, okay? But quite clearly what we can see is that between men and women on dating apps, women have a great deal of it in terms of having selection. Men have a terrible deal of it. Women are facing their own unique issues with the paradox of choice, and men are facing their own issues in terms of complete scarcity. Now, what does this mean? Well, at the end of the day, it means the dating apps make money. Although, to be fair, dating apps like Bumble and other companies within the Match Group company profile have, on average, declined 80 to 90% over the last 12 months. So they've just absolutely gone down the drain. In fact, it's funny to note that I believe the CEO of Bumble, originally she worked at Tinder and left because she felt she was being discriminated or was experiencing sexual harassment. She then started Bumble as a feminist dating app, right, to give women the power and the choice to choose the profiles. And she has run that company into the ground, obviously, and reduced the stock price by 90%. In fact, I believe, if I'm correct, she was the youngest female billionaire in the world at one stage. So talk about being a cock rooster one day and a feather duster the next. That is brutal. Hopefully she sold out. Maybe that's why it tanked, because she got out of there. I highly doubt it, though. Now, on that point of profit, so what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing that women are more likely to stay on the app because they're unsatisfied, and men are more likely to stay on the app because... I feel like I should have a top hat and a monocle there, because they're not getting matches, and so they stay on there hoping to get matches. Now, what do I want to say about this? Well, what I want to say about this is quite clearly there's a sexism built into the app, isn't there? Okay? Women can get 200 matches, right, within their first week. A guy might get 10 matches. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the guy feels that he needs to pay to play, right? And I've experimented with this recently using Bumble, right? So I got the app, and back in the early days of all these apps, it gave you significant matches. You got a lot of interest from people in your area, right? Now it doesn't do that very much, okay? It just doesn't do that. It did that to reel you in to use the app, and now it doesn't. Now, men are going to pay a fee, whatever that fee might be, $40 to $70 a month, in order to effectively use the unlimited matching function, which a lot of guys just use, and they don't even look at the profile, not because they're shallow, but because it's disheartening to look at a beautiful woman and go, I'm probably never going to match her. So you match as many as you can and hope that you strike it lucky. Meanwhile, the woman's got all these matches, and she doesn't have to pay for anything, and she can just pick and choose who she wants to be with. So the apps are set up to keep men and women on the dating app and to be perpetually unhappy and continually dating ad infinitum, right? That's the way these are set up. I'd like to probably talk about this a little bit more and around the profit motive involved, but it's quite clear that these are set up to not benefit men. So my advice to men is that if you want to use the dating apps, unfortunately, it's likely you're going to have to pay to use them to get any benefit from them. But I would say that you use them maybe as 25 to 30% of your dating strategy, and the remaining 70 to 75% of the time, you've really just got to go out and cold approach women and do it in an appropriate way. And probably not a great idea to be doing it when alcohol's involved if you can avoid it. But those are social events. Maybe you can try to do things there. But just approaching a woman in a supermarket or at a cafe or something and being polite and paying a genuine compliment, that can really pay off. All right, I know it's scary, but that's something you really need to do. These apps are just going to make you frustrated and bitter at women, and it's not a good idea. So anyway, I guess what I want to say is that, dating apps were designed to expand our opportunities to find romantic connection and true love. And they haven't done that. In fact, they've made it significantly worse. And I don't see a way forward with improving dating apps, because the fact of the matter is that the current business model, it works. It makes the companies money. So there is no reason for a company to change things to genuinely help people match. So for the men and women out there watching this video, particularly the men, just know that it is rigged against you. And the fact of the matter is you need to be old school and get out there and talk. If you're a man, talk to women, and women need to talk to men as best as possible. Obviously, the men's got to always approach, and that's factored into the apps, right? And a feminist dating app like Bumble doesn't work very well. Women are given the option to match the men, and then they just don't, even when they're given all the choice. Women want to be pursued and want the man to chase them, and you hear them say it, but then they simultaneously say creep, predator, weirdo, whatever. And then they say, why don't men approach me when I'm all dressed up nice at the bar? Okay? Well, because post-Me Too movement, men are scared to do that. And then we're giving these dating apps where we don't even have a chance there either. Okay? So my final thing to say is just to all men and women, try to have real life, genuine connections. Risk coming across goofy, risk stumbling on your words and going bright red and feeling butterflies in your stomach approaching someone asking for their number. You've got to do it, and it may pay off and be something really, really beautiful for you. So anyway, that's all I've got to say today. I'd love to talk about this more. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.